Hello and welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is message batching in Azure Logic Apps. This is going to be based upon the consumption SKU, and this is part one of a two-part series. Let's go. Alright, so why is this important? So message batching is a foundational capability needed inside of iPaaS. And what it does is it allows you to essentially hold back messages until a specific threshold is met. And these thresholds really can be achieved through a combination of three different ways. Number of messages, so for example 10. The size of messages, maybe 100 megs, or schedule every hour. And so this allows you to basically hold back messages from your subscribing or your downstream system while these different thresholds are being addressed. And so it could be a scenario where, perhaps you need to do even it could be like energy sort of pricing or something like that, where you want to do things like on an hourly basis. And so what you want to do is wait for like that hour to sort of expire or elapse, and then be able to bring in all of those requests for that specific time frame and then go ahead and process them. So that would be one scenario where this could be beneficial. Now, the other thing we can do, and we're going to talk about this in next week's video, so this will be part two, is we can use something called partitions that allows us to create almost like these multiple batches based upon some sort of common characteristic. So it could be based upon, say, a specific order, like this is order one, and we're waiting for all of these sort of parts to sort of come along with order one before we go ahead and process it. So you can essentially go ahead and create these batches based upon some sort of identifier within the message. And so this is quite flexible, kind of depends on your scenario for that. Now, another benefit of using batching could be for planned or unplanned maintenance. And I wouldn't use this specifically around load leveling, but you could argue in some ways perhaps it does work. So for example, some systems might have sort of busy processing times where it is expensive to handle a lot of like discrete transaction, like one after another, bang, bang, bang. Especially if that is a system where there's, say, a lot of user interaction going on. Versus perhaps there's some batch scenarios where, you've got users that are using the system during the day, but in the evening they're not. And so as a result, you can kind of hold back all of these requests and then go ahead and sort of process them at later in the day. So you could use it kind of from that perspective as load leveling. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say across the board it is a feature for load leveling, but it depends on your scenario. It might make sense. And then lastly, this feature is currently available in consumption, but this will be available in standard in the not so distant future. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about a scenario. And so what we've got going on here is we've got a sender or a publisher that's incrementally pushing messages. And these messages land inside of Logic Apps, and that can happen through a variety of different connectors. And then what we're going to essentially do inside of Logic Apps is create almost like our own queue, where we can then govern essentially how messages are sort of pulled from that queue. And so for this batching to work, we really need two different Logic Apps. One is going to be our debatching Logic app, and essentially this is going to use the batch connector and a trigger. And then in our publisher, we're going to also use the batch connector, but this will allow us to send to a specific batch. And then what this allows us to do is the receiver, based upon requirements, will wait until a specific period of time, and then we'll process all of these messages at one time. So things to consider when implementing a batch is really around so let's start at the top. So we've got sort of two modes with batch. One is inline, so you can specify your criteria inside of your batch trigger. So this is going to be part of your overall configuration. Or what you can do is specify this in your integration account. Now, the benefit of that is you've kind of now externalized your configuration from your code, and you can make changes in your integration account without modifying your configuration inside the Logic app itself. So if you think about CI/CD pipelines and sort of release processes, if you can go ahead and modify these externally, then you won't have to redeploy your application. So that might be of interest for you. Then we get into batch names. So you need to have a name that's going to be used across both your publisher and your subscriber or receiver, and so you'll want to make sure you've got the same name there. And then we've got the release criteria, and this is, you can kind of think of this as really like the first one wins. So it would be kind of cool if there was a little bit more where you could kind of say, have a little bit more control over the behavior of these. But in general, you can specify the message count, and then you could specify the size of those messages or the schedule itself. So in my scenario, I'm going to have both message count and schedule set up. And so what this will generally mean is I could set up 10 here, and then I could set as maybe just say an hour as for my schedule. And so what'll happen is that, the first one wins. So if 10 messages are populated, those 10 messages will then get processed before the hour's up. However, if only 6 of those messages are published and an hour is basically comes up, then we would go ahead and we would still retrieve those messages. So it's kind of like a race condition in some ways where the first one wins. And so here, just wanted to call out some of the upper limits for the different criteria. So the number of messages to collect. So for example, 10, a batch limit is 8,000. Then batch size is 80 megs. And then the schedule, the minimum is 60 seconds or 1 minute. Fractional minutes are effectively rounded up to 1 minute itself. You also can specify a time zone and start date. So this is kind of handy if you really want to ensure that perhaps like you've got these windows where you want to do batch processing. Perhaps it's around like say 6 p.m. at night. You could essentially start this, and have it run at say 6 a.m. and then have it run for 12 hours. And then at 6 p.m. basically it would get unlocked and you would process those records. Be aware that if you change the release criteria while the trigger still has batched but unsent messages, the trigger will use the updated release criteria for handling the unsent messages. So it's not like the individual messages are stamped. It's basically managed in the trigger itself. Now, we're going to talk more about this next week. I will update the demo to sort of show you this, but you can specify a unique partition key that divides the target batch into logical subsets. So this is where I talk about, say, like a work order. Maybe you need to process all of the work orders, in batches where the work order might have many different states. You get all of these different messages in, and you need to process one work order before, say, another work order. And so we can go ahead and set up partitions, which is kind of a pretty cool feature, and we'll take a look at that next week. So let's go ahead and see a demo, see this in action. And what we'll have is a sender. In my case, it's just going to be a logic app that's going to pump messages to a service bus queue. We're going to have a logic app that's going to essentially retrieve these messages from the queue, insert them into a batch, and that'll be our second logic app. And then our third logic app will be essentially debatcher, where we'll use the batch trigger to basically wait for specific periods, specific thresholds, and then we'll go ahead and process those messages. So let's jump into the demo and take a look. Okay, we're going to start in reverse order. So we're going to start with logic app number 3. Part of the reason for this is that you need to create a batch first before you can send to a batch. So this essentially becomes a prerequisite. So what we're going to do here is we are going to create an inline batch mode. So the other option is integration account. And we're going to provide a batch name. Now you can call this whatever you want. In my case, I'm going to call it batch demo. And then I've got my release criteria. So I've specified message count of 10 and an interval of 3 minutes. Now all we're going to do is just loop through all of the messages, and we're going to just put them in a compose. Now in terms of like what is exposed from the batch trigger itself, is we're going to have the batch content, which is essentially going to be an array. And then as a result, when you go ahead and drop message content in an action, it'll automatically add the loop for you. So that is essentially our content coming from basically our Logic App publisher itself. So at this point, we can go ahead and save this specific Logic App, and then we can go into our publisher. So this one is where we're going to go ahead and retrieve messages from a queue. So in this case, we've got a publisher that's going to send a bunch of messages to a queue. These can happen quite quickly, and as a result, we're going to pull them down from a queue and then go ahead and construct a batch. Now, typically when we think about service bus and especially queues, we can start to do some queues and topics. We can start to do some load leveling in terms of having multiple subscribers and pull messages down. And so that's why batch isn't necessarily a load leveling functionality. It's more of an aggregator than anything else. That's probably the best way to think about it. So what's going to happen is there's going to be multiple Logic App instances instantiated whenever there's a new message in the queue. And remember, we're using consumption, so as a result, this is a managed connector. And so what we're going to do is we're going to receive that message, and we're going to check every minute, and we're then going to go ahead and publish to a batch. So this is the same batch name that we had indicated in our other Logic App. And then what we're going to do is take the content from our service bus message and go ahead and construct it. Now the trigger name and the workflow, these were added automatically for me. Essentially when I go into built-in and I find batch, and this is why you have to create that trigger first, is when you create that trigger, then this will become available. If you come into this connector first without having a batch created, this is going to be blank. And so that's why I mentioned we're going to do this in reverse order so that this information will get automatically populated for us, which is great. And then lastly, our third Logic App. And so we've got a recurrence, and all I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and every time this Logic App runs, I'm going to just create a loop. And I've got an integer account here basically, and I'm going to go ahead and send a message, and I'm going to have a random number, and we'll see this more next week when we talk about partitions. But I'm going to go ahead and send 5 messages every time this Logic App runs. So this will create 5 messages. This is going to take those 5 messages, and there'll be 1 per Logic App instance, and put them into a batch. And so we're going to have initially just 5 here. And what we're going to see is that this Logic App isn't actually going to run until we go ahead and receive 10 messages. So what I'm going to do is head over to my publisher, and let's go ahead and we will run this. And so this should just take a moment. Okay, so that's now run. If we flip over to our Logic App where we consume those messages from Service Bus, this should run within a minute, and we should see 5 entries that show up. Okay, there's our 5 entries. And then if we head over to our Logic App, we should see that this has not run yet. So it hasn't run yet. So let's go ahead and put another 5 messages in. Okay, we've sent in another 5 messages. We've now received and processed those 5 messages. And now if we flip over to our batch, so if we go into the run history for the batch receiver, we can see that we've got the 10 messages processed. So it didn't, process the 5 and then the next 5. It waited until it received 10 messages within that 3-minute period, and then it went ahead and processed those messages. All right, so hopefully that was interesting for you. I think it's a pretty cool feature. Like if you were to go ahead and have to do that yourself, it would be a fair amount of work. And I think we've all kind of been there where you go ahead and create like a staging table, maybe in SQL, where you start to like record all of these transactions. And then you've got, say, another process that runs on some sort of polling mechanism to go do that fetch. And so now you're sort of building a bunch of additional components that you have to manage and implement in order to get this working versus a really an out-of-the-box experience. So very cool. So stay tuned for next week. We'll talk about partitions. But in the meantime, go ahead and check me out on Twitter. If you're not following me, you can find me at Weirzy. Like, subscribes, comments, always welcome. Thanks again for checking out this video. Take care.